Good evening. Most of what we're going to do tonight is a panel discussion, but I thought it might be helpful to very briefly lay out a few themes that are organizing principles about why we're here, some of the things we've learned, and some initial ideas about where we might go. So the first organizing principle, I think, is one that will be familiar to all of you, and that is that development really should be climate resilient. We all recognize that climate change is a leading threat to both development and poverty alleviation, the mission of development agencies of the US government. And so addressing climate change needs to be part of the development agenda. The part we're talking about today obviously is adaptation, not so much the mitigation side, and how can we ensure that our development projects have lasting benefits in the face of a changing climate. So one of the ways that we thought that we need to address this is taking a whole of government approach. All of us work for an agency, and there can be a tendency to work within our own agencies for various reasons, workloads, just the way we work. About a year ago, the President signed an executive order on climate resilient international development. And one of the, for us, the virtues of that order is it brought all of the US government agencies that are relevant together to try to address this problem. It's so large and complex that no one agency can do it by themselves. So we have policy organizations like elements of the Executive Office of the President, the State Department, the Treasury. We also have development agencies like the one I work for, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and USAID, as well as the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture that also does international development investments. And then we have science agencies, names that you know, NOAA, NASA, also the U.S. Geological Service, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program. The idea is that to bring agencies together to see if together we can address challenges to adaptation in a way that would be impossible for individual organizations to do. So the executive order also requires us to systematically understand where our risks are and then begin to address them. So what we're doing is taking a systematic approach to risk management, and I'm not going to go into the details, don't worry about that, but it starts with screening, and we're looking across our portfolios to see where our risks are, and then depending on where we find risks and where we need more information, doing more in-depth analyses to better understand how do we adapt our projects to a changing world, and leading all of those directly to investment decisions. Can we go forward as previously planned? Do we need to make adjustments to make these projects resilient? Or are the challenges so fundamental that we really should not be going forward with the development project? So I wanted to very, very briefly highlight a few of the things that we're learning, and that will be, I think, the subject of much of our discussion tonight. I'm going to use one example sort of as a thread to try to tell a few stories about some aspects of what we learned so far. We also want to recognize, though, that we're early in the process, so we don't feel like we have figured it all out, but we do want to learn as quickly amongst ourselves and also with partners, recognizing that we need to improve our performance quickly. So the first lesson, I think, is that resilience really can be cost effective. I'm going to use an example from the Philippines that I know, but hopefully the lessons are transferable. Adaptation is obviously context specific, so there's no one way of doing it, there's no one cost involved. But I'm going to use an example from the Philippines where the Millennium Challenge Corporation partnered with the government of the Philippines to build a 222-kilometer road on the island of Samar. This is an investment of about $228 million. Now, while we were developing this project, the engineers and project officials involved did a risk assessment. And we concluded that over the next 20 years, this part of the Philippines is going to be subject to more severe and intense rainfall patterns and extreme storm events, as well as a potential rise in sea level. So in response to that, the engineers then got to work, and they made a number of investments. They're the ones that are listed there on the sheet. Raising bridges, upgrading culverts, widening water channels. Again, this is a roads project, so it's the kinds of engineering solutions you might do to make a road more resilient to those kind of more extreme events that we anticipated. Strengthening road embankments, remediation of slopes, and installing seawalls. If you put all those things together, they cost about 10% of the overall cost of doing the project. Now, one of the lessons we learned is, again, the importance of preparing for both current and future risks. In the Philippines in 2013, many of you know Typhoon Haiyan struck. And when it made landfall, winds were over 190 miles an hour, making it one of the strongest storms ever to reach land. Tragically, 6,300 people were killed and over 11 million lost their homes. So it reminded us that even as we focus on extreme future events, even today, climate events today even pose a challenge to us. So learning to respond to these setbacks over the short term, we feel, can also help us learn as we better develop information and respond to it in the future. And it can also bring both the development and the disaster response communities together so we can jointly address problems. Now, I mentioned the investments that we made. The value of those investments became clear after the storm because, fortunately, the road, while in the direct path of Haiyan, survived intact. There were a few areas where there were some landslides, but the road survived. And because it survived, it was able to then provide an artery as part of the emergency response immediately after the storm, and it was able to contribute to the ongoing development of Samar Island after the cleanup was complete. So one lesson then is that it can have those dividends. And a co-benefit then being that facilitating the emergency response was another adaptation benefit of a road that was able to survive. Another lesson we learned is to be sure to think broadly about adaptation options. The ones I mentioned, you might have noticed, all about engineering. And that's certainly part of the problem or part of the solution, looking at those hard or gray responses. But one lesson is to also not forget sort of the green and the soft responses. For example, at the time that the hurricane struck, we were working on trying to also build up the emergency response capabilities, pre-positioning supplies. Unfortunately, that work didn't get complete by the time the storms hit, but it suggested that it's not only the hard infrastructure response we need to focus on. So this is the road today. This is the success that we want to see, infrastructure that's able to survive extreme events and continue to provide benefits. And while it's good to have one road that is able to be resilient, clearly what we're all here to do is to have nations of roads. And so that to achieve that scale, we need to work in partnerships. We're fortunate that many places we worked, the host country governments are leading that discussion. For example, in the Philippines, the government of the Philippines had initiated a process of setting standards for roads to try to make them more adaptable, and we were able to work with them to do that. We feel that those kind of partnerships are key, and right now the government of the Philippines is taking those same standards for climate adaptation and applying them nationally, and we think that's the kind of change we ultimately all seek to achieve. So where do we go from here? And this is my last slide. We think it's addressing shared challenges. Again, as I mentioned before, the challenges are too great for any one agency to address by themselves, or even any one government, or even just government by themselves without civil society and the private sector. So elements that we think we need to integrate into our work, a systematic approach. As we said before, we're both screening investments for risks, and then we're also going to be adjusting projects appropriately following that assessment. Another common thread that we think we need to work on is information and better approaches to doing risk assessment. Better access to climate information is a common challenge that we face in developing countries. And we also think that there's scope for better approaches of using whatever information is at hand, how we can try to do a better job of managing uncertainty with what we have. And lastly, leading through partnerships. Again, we don't believe that we can do it by ourselves, and both within government, working between different agencies, and with our partners overseas, we think is the best chance we all have of moving forward. So with that, I'd like to stop and invite, I think, Ryan.
Thank you, Doug. From after this point, we're going to have a panel discussion with our speakers, as well as our moderator. I'd like to invite our moderator up to the stage. His name is Ryan Carlsgott. He is the Special Assistant to the Global Climate Change Coordinator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. And I do want to note there will be a question and answer from the audience, as well as any questions those have online after this. And if you do have your questions online, please use the hashtag AskUSCenter. Ryan?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank my distinguished panelists for being here today. My first question is for USAID and for Carrie. USAID is a very large organization with a lot of complex work. How did you approach implementation of this executive order, and how has it changed the way you do business?
Thanks very much, Ryan. And I'd like to thank everybody for hanging in with us here on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate you all being here. And Doug, that was a great overview. You hit some of the high points. Before I talk about our approach and how our business has changed a little bit, or how it's in the process of changing, I just wanted to make 2 points. Of course, it's an executive order from the president, so we have to implement it. But we want to implement it at USAID because we know that climate resilient development is smart development. We know, in fact, that taking a look at climate risk ensures that our investments in our partners' development provide positive impacts and do not become obsolete over time, or worse, have negative impacts as a result of climate change. It's also consistent, as Doug referenced, with our mission as AID. The opening part of our mission is we partner to end extreme poverty, making sure that climate change doesn't have negative impacts on the very populations we're trying to help requires that we take a look at what those impacts are. It certainly also provides opportunities, and that's something the executive order also asks us to take a look at. Not only do we look at risks, it's an opportunity to do things a little bit differently. Opportunities to blend adapting with mitigation even. So the second point I wanted to make before I get into how we're going about this is that we've actually been integrating climate and climate risk into our work for some time now. Way back 8 years ago in 2007, we issued guidance to our staff called Adapting to Climate Variability that helped our development practitioners take a look at the vulnerabilities of the programs they were designing and try to make modifications where needed. In 2012, we designed and launched our climate change strategy, and one of the 3 components is integrating climate change. And in 2014, we took a look at some of our experiences to date with that initial guidance we published in 2007 and issued a climate resilient development framework. Shortly after that, and maybe would like to think there was some connection or some input, the president issued the executive order in September 2014. So we have been doing this for some time, but not in as consistent a way as we might. So that brings us to the executive order and how we're implementing it. Beginning October 1st of this year, 2015, we required all of our missions, all of our operating units around the world to climate risk screen all of their new strategies. Strategies, for those in the development community out there, most of you have very similar program cycles as we have. The very highest level and the earliest level is doing a strategy, and from that will flow the more specific investments, the projects, the activities that are on the ground and deliver the results. So that's what we did on October 1st. All new strategies have to be climate risk assessed. And over the course of the next year, we're also going to take a handful of projects and programs that are either in particularly high risk, high vulnerable countries to climate change, or in countries that we have a lot invested, and do more in-depth risk screening of those projects. So that's what's happening over the next year. Beginning in October 1st, 2016, less than 12 months from now, we have committed to climate risk screen all of our programs. So it's a transitional process. It's going to be a considerable effort by the time we get to September 2016, because on an average basis, we might design 70 to 100 large projects a year, and from those flow hundreds of smaller activities and mechanisms. So that's a huge body of work to screen. But we've laid out careful guidance to our staff about how to do a light touch screening initially through the strategies and determine which sectors and which areas, which geographic areas might really warrant more attention, and go deep on the areas that require more attention. So how is it different than what we've been doing so far? We were pretty clear when we laid out our implementation plan for the executive order that we didn't want this just to be a check-the-box exercise. Therefore, we have proposed to start at the very beginning of the process with our strategies. And we decided that we really needed to maximize awareness and capacity among our staff. Like Doug said, we have a whole of government approach on this, and this is definitely a whole of agency approach for us at USAID. We're pulling in people who heretofore really haven't paid much attention to or felt that involved in climate change work. And we're also particularly reaching out to the sector experts. For example, when we screen agriculture projects or health projects, we want to be sure that our deep sector experts have access to specific and detailed data information about the countries they're working in, the regions they're working in, so they can really understand the particular vulnerabilities of the proposed projects and activities. We're also ensuring that all of our staff are aware. We've done a big communication effort to our staff. We will be having specific training. We've organized a team across regions and particularly located in our Bureau of experts on the topic who can reach out and help our country-level staff to do the initial risk screening until they feel more expert at it. We've developed tools. We have country fact sheets, climate risk fact sheets for all the countries that we work in that are online. In fact, you could find it publicly at climatelinks.org. One of our new online programs has a lot of other really interesting information. And we're developing, and we haven't quite finalized yet, a climate risk tool that helps facilitators and moderators walk teams through the screening exercise. That's a work in progress, but it's looking good. And each of our missions, our country offices, has a climate integration lead. So there's a single person for all of our units responsible for moving that forward. So that's kind of a high-level sketch of what we're doing.
Thank you, Carrie. I think I'd throw it to MCC and Doug now. Doug, could you talk about how your agency, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, has your experience in integrating climate resilience into your agency's infrastructure projects?
I mean, sure, this comes up as like part of the pre-feasibility and pre-feasibility studies when you start doing the engineering to a project. What I might mention are some of the challenges which may be common and relevant to the audience, because these are things we struggle with that you may struggle with as well, and we're certainly interested in a dialogue on how to best work through them. I mean, certainly one is managing uncertainty. For example, we did an irrigation project, I believe it was in Moldova, where the climate projections say it's either going to get a lot wetter or it's going to get a lot drier. And it's an irrigation project, which obviously is extremely and intimately tied to water. So this is a big deal. So being able to make more informed decisions today, because again, engineers and project developers are making decisions today and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So we need to make decisions, we need to make them more informed, but how do we do that in a way that's to manage the uncertainty we have, while over the longer term trying to reduce that uncertainty, something that we may come back to a little bit later in terms of our work with science agencies. Another challenge I think that we face, that you may face as well, is balancing costs and benefits. So let's say you're building something. The engineering costs of like doing an incremental increase in how you engineer something to make it more resilient, that's knowable. You know, you can get the engineers together, they can estimate the cost with some precision, and it's a short-term cost, so we know that. The benefits of making that investment, that incremental investment, are more medium-term to long-term, because they're related to, well, did your project hold up in a way that it would not have otherwise? And they're also less certain, because it depends. The example I gave with Typhoon Haiyan, that typhoon happened to hit not long after we build the roads, but you don't know when your infrastructure or your project might be tested. So we use cost-benefit analyses to decide what to do. But that's a challenge when you have short-term, relatively well-known costs and medium-term to long-term benefits that are less certain. How do you square those things? It's a bit of apples and oranges. And lastly, one big challenge certainly is also leveraging, if we're, it's a good step if we can do Project X well, but I think all of us need to find ways to best leverage that success to have more holistic progress, which again comes back to, we think, partnerships. And so how we can best do that is certainly one of the challenges that we face. And in that sense, I think it's, to be frank, a lot of the developing countries we work with are out in front on this. The example I gave with the Philippines, again, they were already thinking about this and developing their own standard. We were able to work with them to pilot it, and then they're able to take that experience nationwide. That seems like a perfect example of a country leading a development agency being part of that process, and then ultimately the country taking that in a place that no development agency ever could. I was recently in El Salvador that has developed a whole unit to look at their Ministry of Public Works to look at these issues. Again, when infrastructure agencies do this and build it into how they do business, I mean, that's part of what we think systematic success looks like. So getting there is, I think, one of both the challenges and the exciting things we see moving forward.
Thank you, Doug. Well, Doug touched on the difficulty of understanding long-term trends in climate, and so I'd love to ask Amanda, who's from NOAA, how do you see your agency helping the development agencies in the United States incorporate climate resilience into their investments?
Absolutely. So NOAA has been very committed to this partnership because we do want to ensure that the decisions and the investments that we're making overseas are making best use of the resources that are out there. And so that requires using the best available science. So NOAA and other science agencies like us want to make our information accessible to as many audiences as possible. We have a long history of working with USAID and with MCC through interagency processes, as well as on the ground in the areas of climate science, impacts, and services. And a lot of this in the past has really been grounded in El Nino, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so now, through this effort, we're sort of expanding that to look at other horizons, looking at climate variability, climate change, both of these to get the short to long-term view of how science can inform decision-making for resilient development, something that both Doug and Carrie mentioned in their comments already. What this looks like specifically is things like jointly supporting interdisciplinary research, bringing together science with socioeconomic research, training, capacity building. We try and help other countries to build their own scientific capacity so that they can have that on the ground and support it from within their own countries. Additionally, we're providing some support right now that's targeted at using climate information for risk management and resilience, because that feeds into building adaptive capacity more broadly. Finally, we believe that it's really important to support cutting-edge climate research that focuses specifically on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation. As an agency, we're often known for basic science research, but we need to move beyond that. We need to understand risks and vulnerabilities to different sectors, and then how audiences' needs are changing over time as a result of these. What that often requires is really strong relationships where we co-produce knowledge with partners on the ground, with the development community. So it's not just scientists sitting in a lab doing some research, but we're working side by side with development partners as well as implementers on the ground so that the information we produce is useful and usable to those partners.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go back to Carrie and ask a question that I know we've gotten before within our agency and from our partners. As you start to understand this increased risk that's out there when you're doing assessments, does this mean that USAID will not work in the high-risk areas? And how is it going to affect where are you going to pull back staff from places or?
I'm smiling because we have definitely had this conversation. This question has come up, and the answer is absolutely not. Because as I mentioned, that our mission as an agency is to partner to end extreme poverty, and we can't decide not to go where the people who need our assistance most are. Only in the most extreme security situations. Of course, we need to be careful of our staff in terms of physical violence and conflict and warfare. But in terms of climate risk, no. I think the answer is we are risk screening for climate to see how we can make our projects better and to make sure that they support the needs of our intended clients. For example, there's a couple of for examples, but I was recently in Bangkok for a number of years, and we have our regional mission for Asia there. We commissioned some climate change studies about changes in the variability of rainfall in the area and what that might mean for agriculture. We have shared broadly the results of that study with governments in the region. They were very keen to have that information, and what it really means for some of our target populations and the governments that we work with is a possible change in the plans, not stopping to do projects in certain areas, but possibly having to come up with alternative ideas about what we do. So, I mean, the answer really is no. The risk screening doesn't mean something will be too risky to do. It means we just have to find a way to do it better.
Thank you. I think maybe I'll ask this to the whole panel. Maybe start with Doug. It's clear that we've learned a lot over the past year, and I worked a little on the interagency process myself. But what are the main lessons that each of your agencies would share with other organizations that are attempting this same effort to make their development assistance climate resilient? What would you tell them as a good lesson?
I mean, some of the ones we mentioned earlier, and again, the caveat being that we feel like we're early in the process, we're on a good path, we have learned some things, but we're still very much ourselves in learning mode. Certainly our discussions with other organizations have helped us understand how to institutionalize this. For example, building tools that are as simple as possible, because if you're involving a broad group of people, as you mentioned for USAID, that means a lot of people that are not climate scientists, that this may be a new thing. And so there's a trade-off between the complexity and scientific accuracy of an approach and the ability to reach and incorporate large groups of people. So we've certainly, as we've gone along, been trying to simplify those processes and frame them in a way that fits with the ongoing work people do. That's why I think a risk management framework works well, because we're talking about risk management for climate change right now, but that's a framework that's used in many different ways by many different people. So it fits well. It's a little bit easier to fit into people's frameworks, I think. But then the challenge is then of then operationalizing this by doing the training and capacity building. I know AID's been working a lot on this as well. There are some places where we're interested in trying to even accelerate our learning to understand the opportunities, and certainly one of them is engaging more broadly. The role of the private sector, for example, in being able to be, they're partners in this. They build the infrastructure that we finance, the role of host governments and other organizations in countries where we work, and how we can better engage with them so we're not islands where we may achieve success, but having a broader discussion is certainly one of those things that we feel like we understand the importance, and now the learning is finding maybe the continue to refine the ways that we do that to be most effective. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Well, I think there are some lessons learned for us already. One of them for USAID is that others have been there already before us. Climate risk screening is becoming a best practice in the development world, and we are thankful to other agencies that were willing to share their time and experience with us, the World Bank, the GIZ, and the AFD. They definitely provided us the benefit of their experience and shared some tools and some good guidance. So I think the lesson learned for us in this, and advice we would give to any other agency, is to reach out to those who have gone through it. I think a second lesson is definitely to socialize within your own organization what it's all about, raise their awareness, train them, give them tools, make it easy, and then listen. Have a feedback loop, hear their questions, try to make sure that everybody really understands the why it will make what we do better, not that it's just an obligation, and make sure they don't feel that it's just a check the box exercise. So that's another lesson. And I think another one, and we certainly have benefited from the fact that it came from the very top from our president, but signals from the top of one's organization really matter in saying to the rest of the organization that this is important and it will make what we do much more impactful, and we need to make sure we move forward very quickly. And I guess one final one I would add is, as a development agency, it's not just for us to do. Doug mentioned reaching out, learning and engaging with host countries, but certainly there are also many NGOs and other organizations, local organizations that implement our programs, and we need to be reaching out to them to have them go through the same process and have the same awareness, and to the extent that they design projects or submit proposals to us that already have been risk screened, we're all much better off. So that's something we need to take on board, and I would recommend to others as well.
I would say one of the lessons we learned is call your scientists early. And I would say that because it's important to have everybody involved from the start, so people feel as though they're part of the solution together, that it's a team effort, and that the scientists are informing the process early on to try and help set the parameters for what is possible in the future and what the risks and impacts are, so that you're not trying to backtrack halfway through. And I think that that's one of the amazing things that this effort has done, is to try and pull the technical community in from the start. The other thing I would say is that engagement needs to be sustained. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be interactive. Resilient development, as much as scientists love to think that everything is science, it's art as much as it is science. And so you really have to have that back and forth where you're constantly redefining what the needs are and understanding how they evolve as the understanding of the situation changes. And then the science and how that applies can also change. You may start off thinking that the scientific work that you need to apply is one thing, but as you delve deeper into understanding what the real issues are, you often find out that the scientific questions are different than what you thought they were at the start.
Very true. Well, before I ask my last question, I just remind those watching online to submit their questions via Twitter with hashtag AskUSCenter, and we'll be taking questions from Twitter and from the audience in just a moment. So my last question for the whole panel, what are the main challenges for agencies in translating that climate information into something that non-climate experts can access, and how do the science agencies help?
Well, we definitely need the assistance of the science agencies. As my colleague mentioned, NOAA and USAID have a long history of working together, and we really depend on their really deep meteorological knowledge. And we also partner with NASA. So some of you might have been here earlier to see the really cool presentation that NASA gave on the hyperwall of all their satellite work. We have a program with NASA called Surveyor, and together in 5 and maybe soon to be 6 centers around the world, we collaborate to provide and interpret satellite data about changing climate and extreme weather events with decision makers on the ground, with governments, with others, for reasons of anticipating changes for their agriculture or evacuating people in case of extreme weather events. So we depend on that deep knowledge. It is an ongoing challenge, however, to get the non-scientists that we have in aid. We do have many scientists, but not often of the sort that help us interpret the weather data or climate data to understand. And so reaching out, being able to reach out to the science specialists at NOAA and at NASA and elsewhere to help us interpret when we have so much information that it is overwhelming, to point to what is the really most relevant information for us to take into account in our decision making. The scientists can help with that.
I will actually say the flip side too, which is from the scientific perspective. Often we think that there's so much that needs to be addressed because there's so many risks and so many impacts, and the development community can provide the prioritization of what is the greatest need in a certain country or certain place. And so the partnership that we have between the science agencies and the development agencies can then help narrow the list of impacts and development priorities to those that are the most important from a risk perspective and a development perspective. Additionally, scientists aren't always known for the ability to speak to audiences outside of themselves, and so the translation of information to yet another audience is a challenge. And we need to we have increased demands on research as a result of the impacts that we're seeing around the world, and so we need to be clear about what it is that the science is saying, but also evolve what we think the science should be doing over time to meet evolving needs, and then present information in ways that is accessible to non-climate scientists. So it really is a translation issue both ways of how do we get the information we have out in a way that's understandable, and I go back to that ongoing dialogue piece, and then how do we take what we learn from those dialogues back to modify the way we do our science and change some of the questions that we answer. And so it is a challenge convincing the scientific community sometimes that the questions that they're asking might not be the only questions that are important to ask at the time.
And this is probably a place where feedback from the audience would be helpful. A while back, the World Bank and the German agency GIZ did a global survey of donors. They were asking donors, what are the big constraints that you face in adaptation? And information came out at the top, climate information, and how you build that in to make more important decisions. And that's something I think that our agencies have experienced as well. So I had 3 thoughts on that. Sometimes it's the information is just hard to access. It may be out there, but it's not easy to access. And so one thing that we are looking forward to continue to develop is ways to make that public good and easily accessible public good. You know, the World Bank does that with their country adaptation profiles. The U.S. government has done this and has ongoing initiatives to do this, I understand as well, that Amanda could speak to. And those things that make it easier to get the information in a digestible form to whoever's making the decision, I think is a kind of low-hanging fruit. Another is, if you're a non-practitioner, there's not a lack of data or information. There's a sea of data. One person referred to it as a fire hose of information. The bigger challenge is, well, what do I do with this? I mean, which model should I use? How much sea level rise should I build into my project? And while there may not be a single answer, or there is not a single answer to that question, I think one way the science agencies can help us is think that through, almost like having a good advisor saying, well, when it comes to sea level rise, we suggest you use this scenario because we think this is probably better than that other scenario. Development professionals or engineers can work to that, but having that counsel, I think, is helpful. Part of the benefit of having a dialogue. And lastly, I think a fruitful area for discussion, too, is how we manage uncertainty even when we don't get the better information that we all seek. We don't get that better downscale climate data that we'd love to have. How, for the decision that happens tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday of next week, how we live with that. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers is experimenting with something now that they call climate risk-informed decision analysis, which is trying to build that uncertainty to bake it right into the analysis. So you don't necessarily choose scenario A or B, but you kind of build them into your analysis and have a single analysis that allows you then to manage that uncertainty in the decision-making process. While we strive to improve the information and its accessibility, we probably also need to figure out how we can just live with the uncertainty that's going to be there. And maybe that's another area where we can have some productive dialogue.
Great. Thank you. I think now we'll ask our MC, Tom, to take some questions from the audience. And since I won't be answering these, I'm going to remove myself.
Could I just say one thing, too? That, you know, you've all heard from us, and we may have some development practitioners out there in the audience. And if you would like to share any of your experiences, we'd like to hear as well.
My name's Laura Kuhl, and I'm at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And I think this is mostly a question for Carrie, but a lot of USAID projects have economic growth as one of kind of the goals of development. And sometimes there can be tensions between that goal and a resilience objective. And I was just wondering how, you know, obviously other times there's a lot of synergies between those two goals as well. But how is USAID, as you're looking to make all of your projects climate resilient, how are you working on those tensions?
That's a really good question. I am one of the senior managers in a bureau that does many different things. It's economic growth, education, environment, but we call it E3, but it's also, there are some other threes in there, engineering and what else is in there? There's a few others, but my own feeling about this is that at some point we ought to be merging some of our environment offices with the economic growth office. I mean, we talk about sustainable economic growth, but sometimes one might ask, are we just using that word? Are we being superficial in that, the use of that? Or should we not really merge our specialists in the two topics and make them work together to ensure that any economic growth projects we sponsor are truly sustainable, climate-proofed, non-impactful on the biodiverse area? And so you raise a point that I've thought about quite a bit, and you know, it's where I really want to push. I have oversight over the environment offices and another manager of the economic growth, but we need to be working together. We need to be talking to one another, so absolutely.
I'm Anbu from Media, and thank you very much for enlightening this issue. And I have two inquiries. One is USD is doing good job. I think you make this development resilient. On the other hand, if you see that is from the recipient point of view, USAID is not the only actor. You have multiple actors, yes, already mentioned. So by bringing this screening method, and if other agencies are not doing, and if they are doing in a different way, it brings a confusion from the recipient point of view. So in this way, and how you coordinated this with the other agencies to synchronize or standardize these screening methods. And my second point of inquiry is, unlike the climate change mitigation, and for the adaptation, most of the funding is coming from the government, the national budgets. So what USAID or the other donors bringing is a small, and it has to be used as a catalytic to upscale other activities. So in this case, and what kind of, you already mentioned, that is there's this kind of extreme events, low frequency but high impact events, and how the countries can prepare. For example, they don't have that any climate information. Rather than calling the US scientist, even their recipient countries, they don't have any information other than the macro model. At the downscale level, the project level, at the district level, they don't have the information, and they don't have the implementation capacity. For example, the engineer, the local level officer, and he cannot differentiate what is the ordinary road project and the climate smart road project. So there's a financing issue, and there is an information gap issues, and there is a decision-making capacity, and how USAID is viewing these problems or its challenges.
Okay, those were two rather complex questions. Let me start a little bit with the second question. Amanda referenced trying to make as much of the scientific data publicly available as possible. And I think across our government, to the extent that we can make a global good, the scientific information about climate change, about weather, it should become available too. And it's a matter of our helping to raise awareness of where it can be accessed. Through this Surveyor project that I mentioned, we are bringing publicly available satellite data that NASA provides into an easily digestible format for decision makers in governments and other local decision makers. Moving to your first question, because I don't think that fully answered your second one. It had multiple pieces, and maybe Doug can answer some of it. It's a really good question about how the donors are coordinating on climate risk screening and implementing changes as a result. As I described, we consulted with other donors who've been out there ahead of us, World Bank, GIZ, the French Development Agency. So we're talking to one another, we're getting advice from, but whether it's happening in a very centralized manner, I am not quite certain. Ryan, I'm not sure where you are, if you happen to know, but I'm pretty certain that this must be a topic of conversation in the Donor Assistance Committee here in the OECD, where they tend to share best practices. I'd like to find out exactly in what more centralized way the climate risk screening of development assistance is happening. Doug?
And from what I understand, that there are some underlying principles which are increasingly becoming more and more common through dialogue about, well, what is risk screening? And different agencies will have their own tools, and they have some variations. Like some agencies will take advantage, consider the adaptive local capacity of an institution when doing that first screening. Others may not. But I think there's like I don't know if it would be a consensus, but an emerging series of principles, which is not dramatically variance between different donor agencies. But we definitely recognize the need to collaborate, because oftentimes, like, donors, even in the aggregate, are a small portion of the capital flows and the investment funds, as you pointed out, in the places where we work. So at best, we are playing, hopefully, some kind of a catalytic role, or linking science expertise that we ourselves don't have, but resides in the government, with decision makers locally, to see if we can bridge those gaps. So I agree with you that donor coordination is one of those things we all strive to, poses challenges, but clearly working together better is central to the path forward.
Just one more comment. It strikes me in the spirit of the development best practice of local ownership, host country ownership, that it might be incumbent upon us in the donor community to work to strengthen government's own capabilities in this regard, and have them eventually lead on this, and talk with those providing assistance to their country or with whom they're collaborating, and requirements of the private sector as they invest in major development projects around the country, that climate risk screening occurs. And these considerations are taken into account.
All right, one question in the back, and I'll get you guys in the front. I'll when I come back.
Thank you for the panel. I'm Julie, representing the Red Cross. I'm curious how, in the climate risk management work that you're doing, you're also managing the shorter-term shocks that may arise during the longer development process, especially in the context of increasing discussions around anticipatory humanitarian action before disasters occur, which would typically fall under then the OFDA remit. Thanks.
We'll take two questions just so we can get some of the other questions that were.
Thank you very much. Christoph Feldkötter, I'm from Germany with GIZ. And first of all, I'm very happy to hear that our experience could contribute to setting up your own screening procedures. There's two things that I have to say. One is a comment on this issue of harmonizing and risk screening entire strategies. When we started out as GIZ with our screening procedures, the initial challenge was, of course, to climate-proof our own interventions. And that started at a relatively low scale. I think that the processes we are discussing here, like the national adaptation planning process, these are the opportunities to harmonize the climate risk screening across all interventions. And that's one of the areas we are actually cooperating on with USAID and State Department in this National Adaptation Planning Global Network, where this is one of the key areas of our intervention to support harmonizing these climate risk screening procedures. Second point I have is a question, actually. Carrie, you mentioned the word opportunities. And that's something we have built into our own screening procedures as well. In most cases, of course, there will be risks associated with climate change, but there are cases where there might be opportunities. Wine growers in Germany, for instance, are seeing much more favorable conditions. We have seen in Vietnam, we have seen the coffee growing areas shift with the shifting climate. That's a risk for some, but that's an opportunity for others. Now, what surprised me is that in our own screening procedure in Germany, hardly anyone ever came up or focused on finding these opportunities. So I was wondering what your experience is there, whether it's only turning out risks, or whether in some, if only a few cases, you also started seeing opportunities.
Okay, I think to start with the question from I've forgotten your name from the Red Cross. OFDA, our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, coordinates quite a bit with, they are among some of our other colleagues, the ones who are working on emergency response, immediate response to natural disaster and other disasters. But they work significantly, while they are not attending to major crises, on disaster risk reduction, which essentially is a form of protecting against, in the case of climate-induced risks, the impacts of climate change. So their continual investment in disaster risk reduction, I think, is one way we as an agency are trying to close the gap. Short-term shocks, again, it's our humanitarian side of the house that ends up dealing with addressing the needs that occur with short-term shocks that we have not anticipated or have been unable to anticipate in collaboration with governments. So it's an ongoing challenge. I think there's probably never enough resources to do what really needs to be done, but it's a mindset of how can we be prepared, how can we anticipate the next shock and become resilient against it, whether it be climate-related or anything else. In terms of opportunities, I guess I have been so struck recently after coming back from my years in Bangkok and working with my colleagues doing fascinating work in clean energy. And being at this event and seeing the price of renewable energies dropping, what an opportunity that is becoming. I mean, initially we are looking at that as mitigation, what ways to reduce emissions and make the problem less. But one of the huge opportunities that is resulting from that are new business opportunities, new jobs for many countries. And so now one could say, are they replacing jobs in the fossil fuel industry? I don't know. But I just think there's incredible dynamism around the world around this topic. So I see that as an opportunity. There are other examples that I have read about in our work that with climate change, with the change in rainfall patterns, certain crops were no longer really prospering. And so with the studies about what other marketable crops might be adopted in a certain area, they've actually made increased profits with the new crops. So, you know, that was an opportunity that was unforeseen, but anticipating how to resolve the negative impact of climate change presented a net positive. So that's another example.
All right, we have time for one more quick question. Anyone have a quick question in the crowd? All right.
Hi, I'm Laura from ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. I'm from the World Secretariat here in Bonn, Germany. And I wanted to ask quickly how you're engaging with local governments, since a lot of our members have projects, have different climate actions that they'd like to implement and they need support. So specifically in the Global South, of course, for USAID, but perhaps with the others in the Global North as well. Thank you.
From a scientific perspective, we produce a lot of global information, but adaptation is local. And so the local knowledge is incredibly important. And so for us, we have to engage with local leaders, with local practitioners, with the people who know the local conditions in order to ensure that the information that we have at a global scale or regional scale is relevant. And so one of the first partners that we look to when we engage internationally are the experts within the region. And oftentimes those are people who work within the local government in water management or in whatever is going on in the region that we're focused on. So that is a place that we often look for some of our first partnerships to fact-check information.
It's a challenging question to answer. I was thinking that earlier this morning I was down in the Paris City Hall attending the C40 event with mayors and other prominent local leaders from around the world, and it was quite fascinating. And they made it very clear, and they're quite right, that many municipalities around the world are out in front of their national governments, and they're blazing the path. Now, we're talking about major cities in many of these cases, and you're probably referring to the local level of the poorer villages and communities. So I think there's kind of two messages. One, for the larger community is I think we should look to the innovation that's happening in cities and at different subnational levels. And the national level governments need to be getting on board and facilitating that change. But also, so what is USAID doing? We certainly recognize we can't be in every village and community around a country that we work in. So it's a matter of working to develop successful models and seeing to the extent to which we can bring them to scale in collaboration with national and provincial level governments. It's not a very satisfying answer, perhaps, because it's a long-term effort and it takes resources to do. But it seems to me, and we do have a number of local government, local governance projects that are attempting to do that. How do we make that a universally effective way of addressing those issues at the local level? I'm not quite certain, but we just need to keep working at it.
Sometimes when we build infrastructure projects, it's often a line ministry in a country where we work. So it's true. It's often, there's different levels of local, as you mentioned. There's local meaning, well, it's the host country, but it's and then we also work with municipalities often when it comes to like zoning of where things go. I think that certainly a challenge is integrating different levels of government in a kind of a combined decision-making process. And like others, I think we're still working on a work on progress, but we realize it's something that we very much aspire to do.
All right, I would like all of you to thank our panelists for that great discussion, and to thank you for the great dialogue afterwards.